Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly special. A country where doing almost anything normal could technically get you arrested. Welcome to the Soviet Union, the only place on earth where buying a pair of jeans, telling a joke, or being unemployed on a Tuesday could earn you a very serious conversation with a very serious man in a very grey coat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas really do shape what happens here, and this channel grows because of people like you. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere. Oh, and we are now live on Spotify, so if you would rather drift off with just the audio, the link is waiting for you down in the description. And for those who want the full uninterrupted experience, there is also an ad-free extended version available through the membership, but only if that sounds like your kind of thing. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise and get comfortable. Let us pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to live somewhere that had a rule for everything and a punishment for almost as much? Could you survive a place where owning the wrong record was a crime, where being late to work was a legal matter, and where a single American dollar tucked in your sock drawer could quietly ruin your entire decade? Would you last a week in a country where the government decided your job, your apartment, your holidays, and occasionally your opinions? And what happens when the most ordinary things you do without thinking, like grumbling about prices or selling a few extra potatoes, are quietly written down as offences against the state? Well, congratulations. You have just woken up somewhere in the Soviet Union. The year is 1975. Your alarm is a distant factory whistle. Your coffee is technically chicory. And almost everything you're about to do today is, in some small and deeply bureaucratic way, against the law. Good luck. Let us start with something small, something harmless, something folded quietly at the bottom of your sock drawer. A single American dollar. In most of the world, this is pocket change. In the Soviet Union, it is a small green rectangle of pure trouble. Private citizens are not permitted to hold foreign currency, and dealing in it is treated as a serious economic crime. That crisp dollar a tourist once tipped you is not a souvenir. It is evidence. And depending on the decade and the size of your stash, the consequences range from thoroughly unpleasant to genuinely terrifying, because at the height of it, large-scale currency dealing could carry the very harshest penalties the state had to offer. Here is the thing that makes it so absurd. The ruble is the only money you are supposed to touch, and the ruble does not travel. It cannot buy anything abroad, and abroad is somewhere you're not going anyway. So a foreign banknote has no legal use in your daily life whatsoever. You cannot spend it at the bakery. The woman behind the counter would faint. You cannot deposit it. The bank would file a report before you finish the sentence. And yet everyone secretly wants one, because that useless little scrap of paper is a key to another universe, the shadow world of foreign goods, imported cigarettes, and things that actually work. So you hide it. You become weirdly protective of a piece of paper worth less than a loaf of bread in the country that printed it. You tuck it behind a photograph, or inside the lining of a coat, or in the hollow belly of a book, feeling exactly like a man burying treasure, except your treasure is $1 and your pirates are accountants. Every time someone knocks on the door, your stomach does a little flip. Was that the neighbour? Or was that the beginning of a very long and very cold story? The truly nerve-wracking part is the exchange itself. If you want to turn that dollar into something useful, you have to find a dealer, and you have to do it in a doorway, in a stairwell, in the corner of a park where the benches have eyes. Money changes hands in a single practiced handshake. Nobody makes eye contact. It is the most tense financial transaction imaginable, and the product is a crumpled 20 from Ohio. And the punishments were not a joke, even when the crime sounds like one. In the early 1960s, two men named Rokotov and Fybyshenko ran a vast black market currency operation, and when they were caught, the law was actually changed to make their offence punishable by death. They were executed for trading money. Let that settle for a moment. In a great deal of the world, moving currency around is an entire respectable profession, complete with corner offices and expensive coffee. Here, at its worst, it was a capital offence. So you sit there in the dark, cradling your single contraband dollar, feeling the strange weight of it, this thin green promise of a life you're not allowed to want. You could exchange it, you could hide it, or you could simply stare at George Washington and wonder what on earth he did to end up as evidence in your sock drawer. Either way, you have committed your first crime of the day, and it is not even light out yet. And speaking of things that could get you into trouble before breakfast, let us get you dressed, because your wardrobe, comrade, is about to become a felony. Now let us get dressed and immediately regret it. You reach for the one item nearly every young person in the country secretly craves: a pair of real Western blue jeans with the little copper rivets and the faint smell of a world you're not allowed to visit. The trouble is, these jeans did not come from a Soviet shop, because Soviet shops did not sell them. They came from a fartsovshchik, a black market trader who deals in foreign goods, and buying from him is illegal. So you're now wearing several months of somebody's salary and a minor criminal offence, all neatly below the waist. You might be wondering why anyone would risk anything for a pair of trousers, but you have to understand what jeans meant here. They were not just clothing. They were a passport, a rebellion, a rumour of America stitched into cotton. Soviet factories made trousers, of course, sturdy and shapeless, and roughly the colour of a rainy Tuesday. What they did not make was denim that fit, denim that faded beautifully, denim that whispered, "You are young, and the world is bigger than this." The famous Western brands were not brands at all here. They were legends. So a whole underground economy grew up around them. The fartsovshchik was the middleman, the smooth operator who lurked near the hotels where foreign tourists stayed, waiting to buy the clothes right off a visitor's back. A Finnish tourist could practically fund his entire vacation by arriving in 3 pairs of jeans and leaving in none. The trader would then sell them onward at a markup that would make a modern luxury boutique blush. And the prices were genuinely insane. A single pair of good Western jeans could cost the equivalent of a month or two of an ordinary worker's wages. Imagine paying 2 months of your salary for one pair of pants, then wearing them constantly, defending them with your life, and repairing them until they were more thread than fabric. People did not casually own 5 pairs of jeans. People owned 1 pair of jeans and a deep, tender, emotional attachment to them. The risk ran in both directions. The trader was committing the crime of speculation, dealing illegally in foreign goods, and if caught could face real prison time. But even you, the humble buyer, were participating in something the state frowned upon, funding a black market and quietly announcing that Soviet fashion was, to put it gently, not cutting it. You were making a statement, and the statement was, "I would like to look like the enemy, please." There is a beautiful absurdity to it all. An entire superpower, with its rockets and its factories and its 5-year plans, could not simply produce a decent pair of jeans, and so its own youth turned to smugglers and stairwell deals to get them. The demand was so relentless that fakes flooded the market too. Badly stitched imitations passed off as the genuine article, and knowing how to spot a real pair became a survival skill in itself. You learned to check the rivets, the stitching, the little tells, like a jeweller inspecting a diamond, except the diamond was denim. So there you stand, dressed at last, wearing what is essentially a small fortune and a quiet act of defiance wrapped around your legs. You look good, you feel dangerous, and you have technically broken the law simply by choosing an outfit, which is a genuinely impressive way to start a morning. Now that you're dressed to offend the state, let us put on some music, because your record collection, it turns out, is even more illegal than your trousers. Time for a little music quietly, with the volume low and one ear turned toward the door. Western records are banned, so some enterprising soul has pressed your favourite forbidden song onto the only flexible material widely available, a used medical X-ray. That is right. Your rock and roll is playing off somebody's discarded rib cage or fractured skull, ghostly and crackling under the needle. These homemade bootleg discs were nicknamed bone music, and they were gloriously, defiantly illegal. You can just make out the melody beneath the hiss, along with the faint grey shadow of a stranger's lungs. The system was as clever as it was macabre. Real vinyl was scarce and controlled, and Western records were nearly impossible to obtain legally, so underground music lovers got creative. Hospitals threw out mountains of old X-ray film, and that film happened to be just flexible and groovable enough to hold a recording. Bootleggers would get their hands on a smuggled record, cut the X-ray into a rough circle, burn a hole in the centre with a lit cigarette, and use a modified recording machine to etch the music straight into somebody's former chest cavity. The result was a record you could literally see through. Hold it up to the light and there is a spine, a set of ribs, the ghostly curve of a skull. People called them ribs, or bones, or music on the bones, and buying one felt like a transaction out of a spy novel. You did not walk into a shop. You found a guy who knew a guy who happened to have his coat pockets full of X-rayed skeletons humming with forbidden jazz and rock and roll. The sound quality was, to be diplomatic, terrible. These were flimsy, single-sided, and they wore out fast. Play your bootleg of a smuggled tune a few dozen times and it would degrade into pure static, your idol slowly dissolving back into someone's fractured femur. Some bootleggers were reportedly not above a cruel prank either, recording a few seconds of music followed by a mocking voice telling the buyer off for chasing decadent Western trash. You paid good money for a skeleton, and the skeleton insulted you. But people did it anyway, over and over, because the alternative was silence, or worse, only the officially approved music. The state had very firm ideas about what your ear should enjoy, and those ideas did not include the wild, hip-swivelling, morally suspicious sounds drifting in from the West. Rock and roll, certain jazz, anything that sounded too free, too foreign, too fun, was treated as a corrupting influence, a crack in the wall through which dangerous ideas might leak. So the bone records were more than music. They were a tiny act of rebellion you could hold in your hand, spin on a turntable, and dance to in a locked room with the curtains drawn. Each one was a small miracle of stubbornness, proof that you cannot actually ban a melody, no matter how many towers you build or how many rules you write. Music finds a way, even if the way is somebody's old lung scan. Eventually the crackdowns intensified, the equipment improved, tape recorders spread, and the golden age of skeleton records faded. But for a while there, an entire generation fell in love, rebelled, and danced to songs pressed into the bones of the anonymous sick. It is honestly one of the strangest and most beautiful stories in the whole history of music, and it happened because a government tried to silence a song and a nation answered with radiology. So enjoy your ghostly, crackling skeletal soundtrack. Just keep it quiet. Because the next thing you attempted to do, tell a little joke, is somehow even more dangerous than dancing to a dead man's ribs. Here is a genuinely dangerous idea. You think of something funny. Not an ordinary joke, but a political one. The kind whispered in kitchens with a tap running to cover the sound. In most countries, a joke about the leadership earns a tired eye roll. Here it could earn you a file, a knock at the door, and a long unpaid holiday somewhere very cold. The anecdote, the Soviet political joke, was both a national art form and a national risk. Everyone told them, everyone laughed, and everyone glanced, just briefly, at whoever happened to be laughing the loudest. The kitchen was the natural habitat of the anecdote. Out in public, at work, on the street, you kept your face arranged into a mask of pleasant, unremarkable loyalty. But behind a closed apartment door, among people you trusted, with a little vodka on the table and the radio turned up to muddy any listening ears, the jokes came pouring out. They were sharp, they were clever, and they were absolutely everywhere. A secret second language spoken by nearly everyone and admitted by almost no one. The genius of the anecdote was that it could say the unsayable. You could not stand in the square and declare that the economy was a disaster and the leaders were fools. But you could tell a little story about a man waiting 20 years for a car, and everyone would understand exactly what you meant. The joke did the dangerous thinking for you, wrapped in a punchline so that if anyone objected, well, it was only a joke, comrade, only a joke. But here was the terrifying catch. Under the law, spreading anti-Soviet material could be a criminal matter, and in the harsher decades a joke told to the wrong person, or overheard by the wrong ear, genuinely could result in interrogation, a black mark on your record, the loss of your job, or in the darkest years, far worse. There is a grim old joke about this very fact. A man is sentenced to 10 years, and he asks his cellmate what he is in for. The cellmate says, "Nothing, I told a joke." The man replies, "Impossible. The sentence for nothing is only 5 years. That is the whole tragedy and comedy of it in a single breath." The people made jokes about being punished for jokes, which is either the healthiest coping mechanism ever devised or the saddest, depending on how much vodka is left. Humour became armour. If you could laugh at the absurdity, the queues, the shortages, the endless grey weight of it all, then the absurdity had not quite won. You learned quickly who you could tell them to. Family mostly. A few old friends whose loyalty was tested and certain. You did not tell anecdote to your boss, to a stranger, to that overly enthusiastic fellow at the office who was always just a little too interested in everyone's opinions. Because informers were real, and sometimes they were the person you least suspected, and a single reported joke could quietly unravel a life. And yet the jokes never stopped. They multiplied, mutated, and spread from city to city faster than any newspaper, an unstoppable underground river of laughter running beneath the frozen surface of official life. You could ban books and jam radio and lock up copiers, but you could not confiscate a punchline whispered in a kitchen. The joke was the one thing the state could never quite catch. So go ahead, comrade. Think of something funny. Just make very sure of your audience first. Keep your voice down and maybe let the tap run a little longer. Because the next ordinary thing you are legally forbidden from doing is somehow even more absurd than a criminal punchline. You're not allowed to do nothing at all. Let us talk about your job, because here you are legally required to have one. In the Soviet Union, refusing to work was not simply laziness. It was a crime called parasitism. If the state decided you were living without socially useful labour, you could be branded a parasite, publicly shamed, and even exiled to a remote region to be corrected through honest toil. The poet Joseph Brodsky, a future Nobel laureate, was famously convicted of exactly this. So no, you cannot quietly take a year off to find yourself. The state has already found you, and it would like you at a lathe by 8. The logic went something like this. In a workers' state, everyone was supposed to contribute to the collective effort. Idleness was not a personal choice. It was a betrayal of the whole system. If you were able-bodied and not working a recognised job, then you were, by definition, sponging off the labour of everyone else, a parasite feeding on the healthy body of society. And the state had a cure for parasites. The trouble was what actually counted as work. A steady job at a factory, a farm, an office, all fine. But what about a poet? A painter? A translator who took odd freelance jobs and spent long stretches simply thinking and writing? To the authorities, that could look an awful lot like a suspiciously employment-free existence. Never mind that you might be producing some of the finest literature of the century. If it did not come with an official workplace, a stamp and a proper title, it barely counted at all. Which brings us back to Joseph Brodsky. In the early 1960s, this brilliant young poet was hauled before a court and accused of parasitism. The judge reportedly demanded to know who had appointed him a poet, who had enrolled him in the ranks of poets. Brodsky's answer was quietly devastating. He suggested that no one had, that perhaps it came from something higher. The court was not amused. He was sentenced to 5 years of hard labour in the far north, hauling logs and shoveling in the cold, all for the crime of writing verse without a pay slip. Think about that the next time you daydream about quitting everything to become an artist. In much of the modern world, being a starving poet is a lifestyle, a slightly annoying one perhaps, but a legal one. Here it was a court case. Your creative sabbatical was the state's criminal file. The gap year did not exist. There was no finding yourself, only the state finding you first and assigning you somewhere useful. And it was not only artists. The law hung over anyone who slipped outside the neat categories of approved labour. Lose your job under a cloud, drift too long between positions, live in a way the authorities did not understand, and you risk the label. The message was blunt and constant. Your time was not entirely your own. Your labour belonged, in some sense, to the collective, and choosing not to give it was not a private matter but a public offence. So the strange result was a society where unemployment officially did not exist, because being unemployed was against the law. Problem solved, in the most Soviet way imaginable. You did not fix joblessness. You simply made it a crime and pointed everyone toward the nearest factory. There is a bleak comedy in it, but a real sorrow too, for the writers and thinkers and gentle, unclassifiable souls who ended up shoveling snow in exile for the crime of not fitting the form. So report to your assigned workplace, comrade, and do it promptly. Because if merely not working is a crime, then wait until you hear what happens if you show up to work even a little bit late. Speaking of that lathe, whatever you do, do not be late. Back in 1940, under Stalin, a law made arriving more than 20 minutes late to work a criminal offence. Not a stern memo, not a docked bonus, but a matter for the courts. Persistent lateness, or skipping a shift, could mean prison time or forced labour. Imagine oversleeping, then sprinting through the snow with one boot only half on, knowing that the clock on the factory wall is no longer measuring your morning. It is measuring your freedom. Suddenly that gentle snooze button starts to feel like a loaded weapon. To understand this one, you have to understand the mood of the country in 1940. War was looming, industry was being pushed to the absolute limit, and the leadership decided that labour discipline was not a matter of workplace culture, but of national survival. So they reached for the tool they reached for most often. They made it a crime. Under the decree, being more than 20 minutes late without a valid excuse, or leaving your job without permission, could put you in front of a judge and result in a criminal sentence. 20 minutes. Think about your own morning. The alarm that does not go off, the bus that never comes, the child who cannot find a shoe, the queue for bread that stretches around the block. Any one of these ordinary universal little disasters could, in that era, put you on the wrong side of the law. You were not late to work. You were committing an offence against the state, and the state kept careful track of the clock. The pressure this created is hard to imagine. People began arriving obscenely early. terrified of the ticking minute hand, because the margin for error in daily life is razor thin when your commute involves crowded trams, deep snow, and infrastructure that has its own ideas. There were no polite excuses. Traffic was not a reason. Your alarm failing was your problem. The system did not much care why you were late. It only cared that you were, and it had a form to fill out and a court to send you to. And the punishments were not symbolic. Depending on the offence, workers could be sentenced to corrective labour, meaning they kept working but had a chunk of their wages seized, or in more serious cases, actual imprisonment. Leaving a job without authorisation was treated even more harshly. You did not simply quit and stroll off to something better. You were, in a very real sense, assigned to your workplace, and walking away could be treated as something close to desertion. The result was a workforce ruled by the clock and the calendar with an almost military rigidity. The factory whistle was not a friendly reminder. It was a starting gun, and the race was against a criminal record. You can practically feel the collective anxiety of an entire nation staring at their wrists, doing frantic mental arithmetic about whether they could make it through the gate before the terrible 21st minute arrived. Now, in fairness, the harshest versions of these laws were a product of the war era and the years around it, and they were eventually softened and repealed as the decades passed. But for a long stretch, the principle held firm. Your time belonged to the state, your attendance was a legal obligation, and lateness was not a habit to be corrected but an offence to be prosecuted. So set 3 alarms, comrade, sleep in your boots, and never ever hit snooze. Because the next thing you might be tempted to do, make a little money for yourself, is a crime that runs even deeper than a late arrival. You have a clever little idea. You buy something cheap in one town and sell it for a bit more in another. In most of human history, this is simply called trade. In the Soviet Union, it was called speculation, and it was a crime. Buying goods to resell at a profit was treated as parasitic exploitation because profit itself was politically suspect. That harmless instinct to make a little extra on the side, the thing half the modern world does before breakfast, could land you in very real trouble here. The free market was not merely discouraged, it was against the law. To grasp why, you have to step inside the logic of the system. Under Soviet economic thinking, value came from labour, honest physical work that produced something real. Buying an item and reselling it at a higher price produced nothing. You added no work, no craftsmanship, no material. You simply pocketed the difference, and that difference was seen as theft, as exploitation, as money conjured out of the sweat of others. The very act that a modern economy celebrates as entrepreneurship was here treated as a moral failing with a prison sentence attached. So the speculator became a kind of villain in the official story, right up there with the parasite and the hoarder. And yet, in practice, nearly everyone dabbled a little, because the official system simply could not supply what people wanted. Shelves were empty, goods appeared and vanished with no warning. If you happened to get your hands on something desirable, a nice coat, some foreign cosmetics, a stack of hard-to-find spare parts, you were suddenly sitting on a small fortune, and human nature being what it is, temptation followed. This gave rise to a whole shadow economy operating in the cracks of the official one. There was blat, the informal web of favours and connections through which people quietly obtained the unobtainable. There were people who knew people, who could get you a thing for a price, quietly, in a back room. The entire country ran on 2 economies at once, the official grey one printed in the plan, and the unofficial, illegal, indispensable one that actually got things done. Almost everyone touched the second one. Almost no one admitted it. The absurdity was total. In much of the world, spotting a gap in the market and filling it makes you a savvy business person. possibly with a motivational book deal. Here the same instinct made you a criminal. Imagine buying concert tickets and reselling them, or flipping a used car for a profit, or reselling anything at all, and being genuinely afraid of prison for it. That was daily life. The most natural economic reflex a human being can have was quietly outlawed, and the punishments could be serious, scaling up with the size of the operation. A little casual reselling might get you a fine and a stern lecture. A large, organised speculation ring could get you years behind bars, and in the case of major currency and goods operations, we are right back in the dark territory of the very harshest sentences. The state took its monopoly on trade extremely personally, because trade was power and it did not intend to share. So there was a strange doublethink at the heart of it all. Everyone bought and sold in the shadows, everyone relied on the black market to survive, and everyone officially condemned it as a shameful crime. You lived a small, quiet lie every single day, and so did your neighbour, and so did the man who sold you your illegal jeans. So think twice before you flip that spare pair of boots for a profit, comrade. Because the next thing you plan to do tonight, simply read a book, is about to become an act of quiet rebellion. Tonight you're going to read something forbidden. It was printed by no publisher, because no publisher would dare touch it. Instead, it is samizdat, self-published writing typed out by hand on thin onion skin paper, with as many carbon copies as one long-suffering typewriter can bear. Then passed secretly from one trembling hand to the next. Banned novels, smuggled poetry, essays the state would very much prefer everyone forget. Owning it was risky. Copying it was riskier still. And you will read all of it tonight quickly, by dim light. Because tomorrow morning it belongs to somebody else. The word samizdat itself is a small joke, a homemade parody. The state had grand official publishing houses with important-sounding names, so people coined a term that meant, roughly, self-publishing house, gently mocking the whole apparatus. Every kitchen table with a typewriter became its own tiny defiant press, churning out literature the censors had rejected, one painstaking page at a time. And painstaking is exactly the word. There were no easy copies here. You could not photocopy it, because copiers were locked up and watched, a story for another segment, so the reproduction was brutally manual. Someone sat at a typewriter and typed the entire text, stacking sheets of paper with carbon paper between them, so that a single furious typing session might produce 4 or 5 copies at once, each one fainter than the last. The bottom copy was often nearly a ghost, a grey smudge you had to squint at, but you read it anyway, gratefully, because a ghostly forbidden book was still infinitely better than no forbidden book at all. Then the copies travelled. This was the genius and the terror of the whole system. Samizdat spread like a chain letter of the soul. You received a manuscript, you had perhaps one night or a few days with it, and you either read it fast and passed it on, or you sat up until dawn retyping your own copies to keep the chain alive. The most famous works, banned novels and dissident essays and the poetry of silenced writers, circulated invisibly through millions of hands, an entire secret library that existed nowhere official and everywhere unofficial. The risk was real and it was heavy. Producing and distributing samizdat could be treated as anti-Soviet activity, and people were interrogated, harassed, fired, and in serious cases imprisoned for it. You were not just reading a book. You were holding physical proof that you had touched the forbidden, and that proof could be found in a search, sitting there in your drawer, quietly incriminating you. So samizdat reading had its own strange rituals. You read behind locked doors. You did not leave manuscripts lying around. You memorized what you could, because a poem held inside your head could never be confiscated. Some people even committed entire banned works to memory, becoming living libraries, walking archives of everything the state had tried to erase. There is something almost unbearably moving in that image. A person carrying a forbidden masterpiece around inside their own skull, safe from every search and every seizure. And here is the quiet triumph. The censors could ban a book, pulp it, refuse to print it, but they could not stop a determined reader with a typewriter and a long night ahead. The more they suppressed a text, the more precious and sought after it became. Forbidding a book turned out to be the single most effective advertising campaign imaginable. So read fast tonight, comrade, and read carefully, and when you are done, pass it on and tell no one where it came from. Because that battered typewriter you used to make your copies is about to become a suspect in its own right. Which brings us neatly to the machine that made that book, your typewriter. In a country deeply frightened of uncontrolled words, even the humble tools of writing were watched. Typewriters, and later copying machines, were often controlled, logged, and in many workplaces locked away, so that no one could quietly reproduce forbidden material. Every typeface has its own faint fingerprint. Every clacking key leaves a trace on the page, so that innocent little machine sitting on your desk was not just for letters to your aunt. In the wrong hands, it became a printing press, and printing presses made this government extremely nervous. The core fear was simple. Words were dangerous. A single typewriter could produce leaflets, manifestos, banned poetry, and copies of samizdat quietly, in a bedroom, with no oversight at all. To a state obsessed with controlling every official message, an unmonitored machine that reproduced text was practically a small unlicensed rebellion sitting on a kitchen table. And so, the humble typewriter, that most ordinary of office objects, became something to keep an eye on. In many offices and institutions, typewriters were treated almost like weapons in an armory. They were registered, assigned, and kept under lock and key. Access was recorded. In some places, the authorities kept samples of the typescript from individual machines, because it turns out that no two typewriters print in exactly the same way. Tiny imperfections in the letters, a slightly raised E, a chipped comma, a key that struck a hair too high, created a unique signature. If a forbidden leaflet turned up, investigators could, in principle, match its typescript to a specific machine, and from the machine to a person. Sit with that for a moment. It means the very letters on the page could betray you. A confession you never made, written in the fingerprints of your own typewriter. You could type the most seditious thing imaginable and never sign your name, and still the machine would testify against you in its own silent, mechanical handwriting. In a world long before every crime could be traced digitally, they had already turned an ordinary appliance into an informant. For ordinary citizens, the picture was less extreme but still shadowed. Owning a personal typewriter was not itself a grand crime, but it placed you near the edge of something the state cared about very much. If you were the sort of person who might copy the wrong text, that machine made you capable, and capability drew attention. People who did produce samizdat were acutely aware of the danger, sometimes borrowing machines, sometimes typing far from home, all to keep their own typewriter's fingerprint off the forbidden page. The whole thing reveals a certain paranoid genius. The state understood that ideas were the real threat, more dangerous than any smuggled pair of jeans, and that ideas spread through copies. Control the means of copying, and you throttle the spread of anything you didn't authorize. Lock up the typewriters and the copiers, log every page, and dissent has to squeeze itself through a much narrower pipe, one exhausting carbon copy at a time. And yet, as with everything, people found the gaps. They typed anyway in secret, accepting the risk, because the alternative was letting the words simply die. Every faint carbon copy that survived was a small victory over a system that tried to make even the alphabet obedient. So handle that typewriter with care, comrade. Type your innocent letters and think very hard before you type anything else, because your machine remembers everything and it is not on your side. And if the written word is this dangerous, imagine how the state feels about voices, foreign voices drifting in over the airwaves in the dead of night. Late at night you do something quietly rebellious. You turn a dial. Somewhere in the crackle and hiss, past the deliberate electronic wailing of the Soviet jamming towers, a foreign voice cuts through. Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, the BBC, speaking calmly of a world beyond the border. Listening was discouraged and, in the worst times, genuinely dangerous, and the state spent staggering effort drowning these signals under manufactured noise. So you press your ear right against the speaker, volume almost off, chasing whole sentences through a storm of static, learning the news of your own country from a voice 1,000 miles away. The state controlled the news the way it controlled everything else, tightly and completely. The newspapers said what they were told to say. The radio and television broadcast the official version of reality, a smooth and confident story in which the plan was always succeeding and the future was always bright. But out there, beyond the border, other broadcasters beamed in different stories, in Russian and in dozens of other languages, offering news, music, and perspectives the official channels would never allow. And people were desperate to hear them, so the state fought back with noise. It built an enormous network of jamming stations whose entire purpose was to blanket the foreign frequencies in howling, warbling interference, a wall of manufactured static designed to make the forbidden broadcasts unlistenable. It was a genuinely vast undertaking, pouring huge resources into the simple goal of stopping citizens from hearing certain voices. Think about that. An entire arm of the state dedicated to producing pure electronic garbage, all to keep a radio program from reaching your ears. But the listeners were stubborn and inventive. You learned the tricks. Late at night the jamming was sometimes weaker, so that is when you tuned in. You fiddled endlessly with the dial, hunting for the clearest sliver of signal in the storm. You knew which frequencies to try, which times of day gave the best reception, how to nudge the antenna just so. Listening to foreign radio became a skill, an art, a nightly ritual of patience conducted at whisper volume, with the whole family leaning in. And what you heard was electric precisely because it was forbidden. News about your own country that your own country would not tell you. Reports on events the official press had simply pretended did not happen. Music that never touched Soviet airwaves. Even the plain, calm tone of the foreign announcers felt like a small miracle. A voice that was not shouting slogans, just talking, as if the listener were a thinking adult who could handle the truth. The risk sat in the background, quiet but real. Simply owning a radio was fine, and huge numbers of people listened, so it was not as though everyone who tuned in vanished into the night. But it was frowned upon, watched in certain circumstances, and in the harsher years, and for people already under suspicion, a known habit of listening to enemy broadcasts could become one more mark against you. So most people did it discreetly, volume low, curtains of static and curtains of cloth both drawn. There is something quietly beautiful about the whole scene. A family gathered around a glowing radio in the dark, straining together through the howl of deliberate interference to catch a few true sentences from the wider world. The state spent a fortune to fill the air with noise, and still the voices got through, thin and crackling and impossible to fully silence. You cannot jam curiosity. You cannot build a tower tall enough to block the simple human desire to know what is actually going on. So keep the volume low, comrade, and keep chasing that signal through the static. Because whether it is a voice on the radio, A joke in the kitchen, or a book typed by hand, the pattern is always the same. The state builds a wall, and the people, patiently, stubbornly, endlessly, find the crack in it. Here the tone softens because faith in the Soviet Union was a serious and often painful matter. The state was officially atheist. Churches were closed or repurposed, clergy were persecuted, and open religious practice could quietly cost you your career or a great deal more. Believers who wished to baptize a child or hold a service often did so in private homes, far from official eyes. So tonight, if you carry any faith at all, you carry it very carefully. What much of the world does openly in a bright hall full of music and light, you may have to do in a small kitchen, in a whisper, with the curtains firmly drawn. The state did not simply ignore religion, it set out to replace it. The official worldview held that belief in God was a relic of the old order, a superstition that a modern scientific society would outgrow and should be helped to outgrow. Vast numbers of churches, mosques and synagogues were shut down over the decades. Their buildings turned into warehouses, clubs, museums of atheism, or simply left to crumble. What had been the centre of a community's life could become a storage depot for grain. For an ordinary believer, this meant living a quiet double life. You might go through your workday as a perfectly loyal citizen, and then, in the evening, gather in secret with a handful of others to pray. Religious education of children was heavily restricted, so parents and grandparents passed on their faith in hushed voices, teaching the old prayers the way you might teach a family secret, carefully and to be kept close. The baptism of a child captures the whole quiet tension of it. In much of the world, this is a joyful public event, announced to everyone, celebrated openly. Here it could be a genuine risk. A public figure or a party member whose child was baptized might face real professional consequences if it were discovered. So families found ways. They travelled to distant churches where no one knew them. They arranged things quietly through trusted priests. They did in the shadows what should have been done in the sunlight, simply to hold on to something that mattered to them, and the pressure was constant and woven into daily life. Advancement in many careers was smoother for those who publicly embraced atheism. Open devotion could mark you as backward, unreliable, not fully committed to the cause. Young people were steered firmly toward the official youth organizations and away from the church. The message, repeated in 1,000 small ways, was that faith was something to be embarrassed by, something to leave behind. Yet belief endured, quietly and stubbornly across all those decades. Grandmothers kept icons hidden away and brought them out behind closed doors. Old tradition survived in the corners of family life. People who had every official reason to abandon their faith simply did not, holding on to it in private through a lifetime of discouragement. There is a deep and unshowy courage in that, in keeping a candle lit inside yourself when the whole world outside insists you blow it out. This is not a segment for jokes, and it does not need any. It is enough to sit for a moment with the plain reality of it, something that in most of human history has been as ordinary and open as a shared meal. The practice of one's faith was here pushed into whispers and locked rooms, and still, gently, it persisted. So hold your quiet beliefs close tonight, comrade, whatever they may be, because the next thing the state took a strange dislike to is far lighter, and honestly one of the most delightfully petty bands in the whole story. They came at one point for the Christmas tree. Let us lighten things back up with a tree. In the early Soviet years, the Christmas tree was condemned as a religious and bourgeois relic and effectively banned, its cheerful little lights deemed politically incorrect. Then, in the mid-1930s, the state performed a magnificent act of rebranding. The tree came back, but now as a New Year tree, topped not with a Star of Bethlehem, but with a bright red Soviet star. Same tree, same tinsel, entirely different paperwork. So decorate away, comrade, just be absolutely certain you are celebrating the correct and approved calendar event. The original logic was at least consistent, in a joyless sort of way. The decorated tree was tied to Christmas. Christmas was religious, religion was the enemy, and therefore the tree had to go. On top of that, a fancy decorated fir smacked of old bourgeois family traditions, the cosy domestic sentimentality the revolution was supposed to sweep away. So for a stretch, putting up a festive tree was frowned upon as a small twinkling act of ideological backsliding. Picture the absurdity of it. Somewhere, a family draws the curtains not to hide a printing press or a stack of forbidden books, but to decorate a small pine tree. The children keep their voices down. A parent glances at the window, and the terribly subversive contraband at the heart of it all is a bit of tinsel and a few painted baubles. The mighty machinery of the state, briefly, versus a shrub. But then came one of the great pragmatic pivots in the whole history of holiday decor. In the mid-1930s, a prominent official publicly suggested that children should not be deprived of a festive tree, and just like that, the policy reversed. The tree was rehabilitated. Only now it was firmly detached from Christmas and reassigned to New Year, a secular holiday the state was much happier to celebrate. The religious meaning was scrubbed off, and a new politically safe meaning was bolted on in its place. The transformation was gloriously literal. The star on top, which had once represented the Star of Bethlehem, was swapped for the 5-pointed red star, the very symbol of the Soviet state. The tree did not change. The lights did not change. The presents underneath did not change. Only the official story around it changed. It was the same beloved tradition wearing a brand new ideological hat, and everyone simply agreed to call it something else. And it worked beautifully. The New Year tree became a cherished centerpiece of the year, a warm and glittering celebration in the depths of winter, complete with its own gift-bringing figure, a jolly fellow in the same broad family as the Western Christmas gift giver, arriving with a granddaughter helper and a sack of presents. A holiday the state could fully endorse, wholesome, secular, and free of any inconvenient references to the divine. So the humble fir tree got to experience the full Soviet journey in miniature. First, it was a suspect, a bourgeois religious relic to be discouraged. Then it was pardoned, rebranded, and promoted to beloved national tradition, its politics carefully corrected from the top down. Few objects have had such a complete change in legal status while remaining, in every way that matters to a child, exactly the same lovely tree. So trim your branches, comrade, string up the lights, and just remember to top it with the right star. Because the next thing you might reasonably want to do, take a little holiday somewhere far away, runs into a much harder wall. It turns out you're not entirely free to leave. You fancy a holiday, somewhere warm, somewhere abroad, somewhere that is simply anywhere else. Unfortunately, you happen to live in a country you're not free to leave. Foreign travel required official permission, exit visas were notoriously hard to obtain, and attempting to slip across the border without approval was treated as a grave crime. Those who tried were labelled defectors, and the frontier was guarded accordingly. So that most ordinary daydream, the one where you simply pack a bag and go, is not a plan here. It is a fantasy, and depending on who overhears it, very nearly a confession. In much of the world, a passport is a thing you own, a small book that says you are free to come and go. In the Soviet Union, the freedom to leave was not yours by default. It was a privilege the state granted sparingly to people it trusted for reasons it approved of. You could not simply decide to see Paris. You had to apply and be assessed and be found reliable, and even then the answer was very often no. Travelling to a friendly socialist neighbour was somewhat more attainable, though still bound up in permissions and paperwork. But travelling to the west, to the capitalist world on the other side of that heavily guarded line, was a rare and jealously controlled thing. The fear was obvious. Let too many people wander freely into that other world, and some of them might see things, want things, or simply not come back. So the door was kept firmly shut, and the keys stayed with the state. For those who did want to go for good, the path was agonizing. Applying to emigrate could itself be dangerous. The mere act of requesting to leave could mark you as disloyal, cost you your job, and leave you stranded in a miserable limbo, neither allowed out nor welcome to stay. People waited years, sometimes fruitlessly, their lives frozen in place by a single unanswered application. And the border itself was not a friendly line on a map with a board official stamping documents. Long stretches of it were a serious military frontier, watched, fenced, patrolled, and in places genuinely deadly to approach without authorization. This was not a boundary designed mainly to keep others out. It was designed to a striking degree to keep its own people in. That is the detail that lands hardest. A wall that faces inward. Think about how strange that is against the ordinary modern instinct. Today, huge numbers of people treat crossing borders as a casual rite, hopping on a plane for a long weekend, complaining about the legroom. Here, that same casual hop was for most people simply impossible, a locked gate at the edge of the only world you were permitted to know. Your horizon was the border, and the border did not open for you. The result was a peculiar kind of confinement, a whole vast country that its citizens largely could not leave at will. You could roam its enormous interior, but the exit was guarded. For most people, the world beyond was something you learned about through those crackling forbidden radio broadcasts, or glimpsed in a smuggled magazine, or imagined while running your thumb over a contraband foreign banknote. Known, longed for, and out of reach. So put away the daydream of packing a bag and simply going, "Comrade, your travels for now stay inside the lines, and if the state is this nervous about you leaving to meet foreigners, you can imagine how it feels about foreigners coming here to meet you." A cheerful tourist smiles at you on the street and asks for directions. Careful now. Contact with foreigners was often viewed with deep suspicion, sometimes reported and occasionally investigated. A friendly chat, an exchanged address, an accepted little gift, any of it could quietly mark you as someone worth keeping an eye on. Ordinary human warmth toward a visiting stranger, the most natural thing in the world, becomes a small act of courage. So you help with the directions politely and briefly, and then you do not linger, because somewhere nearby a notebook may already be opening. The suspicion had a certain internal logic, cold as it was. If the outside world was the ideological enemy, then people from the outside world were, at least potentially, carriers of enemy ideas, enemy money and enemy influence. A foreigner might be a spy. A foreigner might be a bad influence. A foreigner might, simply by chatting about ordinary life back home, plant seeds of dangerous comparison. So contact with them was hedged about with caution, and, for many people, with genuine fear. Foreign visitors were often kept on a fairly tight leash themselves, steered toward approved hotels, approved restaurants, and approved sites, sometimes accompanied by guides who were rather more than guides. The goal was to manage the encounter, to keep the meeting of the worlds carefully controlled. Spontaneous, unsupervised friendship between a citizen and a visitor was exactly the sort of unscripted event the system disliked. And so, ordinary kindness carried a faint charge of risk. Inviting a foreign acquaintance to your home, that basic human gesture of hospitality, could be a genuinely fraught decision. Accepting gifts from them, especially anything Western and desirable, edged toward the dangerous territory of foreign goods and currency, Exchanging letters with someone abroad could draw quiet attention. Even a warm public conversation might be noticed by the wrong person and remembered. The tragedy in this is subtle, but real. Human beings are naturally curious about one another. Meeting someone from a far-off place, hearing about their life, comparing your worlds, this is one of the great small pleasures of being alive. The system took that ordinary curiosity and made it feel unsafe. It asked people to treat the stranger not as a fascinating guest, but as a potential problem, to weigh a friendly hello against a possible consequence. Of course, plenty of contact still happened, and not everyone who spoke to a tourist ended up in trouble. Millions of ordinary interactions passed without incident. But the awareness was always there, a low hum of caution in the back of the mind, especially for anyone in a sensitive job or already under any kind of watchful eye. You learned to be a little guarded, a little brief, to enjoy the encounter and then move along before it became something to explain. There's a quiet sadness in imagining it. A traveller and a local, two curious people who might, in another world, have become friends, sharing a warm exchange on a street corner and then parting quickly, one because he is only passing through, and the other because lingering is unwise. Warmth cut short by the weather of the times. So point the tourist toward the museum, comrade, wish him well and walk on. And once you have said your careful goodbye, you might be tempted to capture the moment, to snap a nice photograph of the handsome city around you. Lower that camera. Because pointing a lens at the wrong thing is its own small crime. You raise your camera to capture a harmless holiday snapshot, a handsome bridge, a grand train station, a nice sweeping industrial skyline. Lower it. Photographing bridges, railways, ports, airports, and anything vaguely strategic was restricted, and a tourist with a camera in the wrong spot could soon find himself explaining his hobby to some deeply unamused officials. The country is enormous, endlessly photogenic, and absolutely covered in things you're not permitted to point a lens at. So compose your shot with great care, because in the Soviet Union even a pretty picture could end up being interrogated. The reasoning once again was rooted in a deep and sweeping caution about information. A photograph is a record. A record can travel. A record can be studied by unfriendly eyes. So anything that might conceivably be of use to an enemy, a bridge, a rail junction, a harbour, a factory, a military installation, and quite a lot of things that only distantly resembled any of those, was treated as something not to be captured on film. The lens became a suspect instrument, and the person holding it a potential collector of secrets. For the ordinary traveller, this created a landscape full of invisible tripwires. The trouble was that you could not always tell what was forbidden. A perfectly ordinary-looking view might contain, somewhere in the frame, something the authorities considered sensitive. That charming bridge over the river, infrastructure. That grand station full of atmospheric steam and bustle, transport strategic, off-limits. You might raise your camera for what looked like a postcard and be lining up a shot of something that would get your film confiscated, and confiscated it could be. A visitor caught photographing the wrong subject might have his camera seized, his film pulled out and exposed to ruin the images, and himself detained for an uncomfortable conversation about what exactly he had been trying to document and for whom. What was, in the photographer's mind, a bit of holiday sightseeing could look, in an official's mind, like reconnaissance. The gap between those two interpretations was where the trouble lived. There is a real absurdity in it, because so much of what was protected was also completely visible. The bridge was right there. Anyone could stand and look at it with their own two eyes. The station was full of people every single day. It was not the seeing that was forbidden exactly, but the capturing, the fixing of the image onto film where it could be carried away and kept. as if the danger lived not in the thing itself but in its portrait. So travellers learned to be cautious with their cameras, to think before they clicked, to avoid pointing expensive foreign lenses at anything that might be construed as sensitive. Whole categories of ordinary, beautiful, everyday scenes went undocumented simply because raising a camera toward them was not worth the risk. A country of astonishing sights, quietly under-photographed by the very people passing through it. It says something about the mindset of the whole system. A society so anxious about control that it worried over snapshots, so wary of the outside gaze that it treated a tourist's photo album as a potential intelligence file. In a place where the written word was policed and the spoken word was watched, it should be no surprise that the captured image was policed too. So keep your camera low and your subject safe, comrade. Photograph the flowers, perhaps, and leave the bridges alone. And once you have finished not taking pictures, you might think about settling down somewhere nice. Except where you get to live, it turns out, is also not entirely up to you. You decide to move to the big city. You will simply pack up, go, find a little apartment, and start fresh. Not so fast. To live legally in a given place you needed a propiska, a residence permit stamped into your internal passport, and without it you could not lawfully settle, work, or remain. Moving to somewhere desirable like Moscow was famously difficult. So that most basic of freedoms, the right to choose where you lay your own head, was not actually yours to choose. The state assigned you a dot on the map, and stepping off that dot required permission and a great deal of ink. The propiska was a stamp that tied a person to a place. It recorded where you were officially registered to live, and it was woven into nearly everything. Your right to housing, your access to a job, your ability to use local services, all of it flowed from having the correct registration for the correct location. Without the proper propiska, you were, in an official sense, not supposed to be where you were standing. This turned the simple act of relocating into a bureaucratic ordeal, especially when it came to the most sought-after cities. Places like Moscow were tightly controlled, their populations managed by limiting who could register to live there. You could not just show up, rent a room, and become a Muscovite. You needed permission to register, and permission was not freely given. The city was, in effect, a club with a very selective membership list, and the propiska was the card. The result was a whole tangle of workarounds and frustrations that shaped people's lives in deep ways. A job in the city often required a city propiska, but getting the city propiska could require already having the job, or the housing, or a family connection, a maddening circle. Some people married partly for registration. Some lived and worked in a place for years without proper papers, always slightly outside the rules, always a little exposed. Your legal existence was pinned to a stamp, and the stamp did not move as freely as you did. Contrast that with the ordinary modern assumption that you can live wherever you can afford to. Fancy a change of city? You find a place, you sign a lease, you go. It is treated as one of the simplest freedoms there is, so basic that most people never think of it as a freedom at all. Hear that freedom was rationed, administered, and often denied. Where you belonged was, to a real degree, a decision made above your head. There was a logic to it, of course, from the state's point of view. Controlling where people lived helped control the labour force, manage the crowding of cities, and keep track of the population. People could be steered toward where workers were needed and away from where they were not. It was population as a resource to be allocated, and the propiska was the tool of allocation. But for the individual, it meant that a fundamental piece of ordinary life, the choice of home, came with a gatekeeper. Your passport did not just say who you were, it said where you were permitted to be, and that permission was not something you could simply grant yourself. So make peace with your assigned dot on the map, comrade, or begin the long paperwork pilgrimage toward a new one. and once you have sorted out where you are allowed to live, you might try to make a little honest money from the garden you tend there. Even that, it turns out, has its limits. You grew some vegetables, lovely work. Now you would like to sell the surplus at the market. This one is a touch gentler, because small private plots and the collective farm markets genuinely did exist, but selling was tightly regulated, and anything that started to resemble a real private business was forbidden. Cross the invisible line from unloading a few spare carrots into something organised and profitable, and you drift right back toward that dreaded word, speculation. So yes, you may sell your potatoes. Just try not to get ambitious about it, and definitely do not go building yourself a potato empire. The private plot was one of the system's quiet contradictions. In a country built on collective agriculture, where the land and its harvests belonged in principle to everyone and were managed by the state, ordinary families were nonetheless often allowed a small patch of their own, a modest garden, a few animals, a corner of earth to tend personally. And here is the delicious irony. Those tiny private plots were astonishingly productive, feeding a remarkable share of the population, despite covering only a sliver of the farmland. It turns out that when people grow food for themselves, on their own little patch, with the right to keep or sell what they produce, they tend to work at it with rather more enthusiasm than they bring to an enormous impersonal collective field. The private plot flourished precisely because it was private, which was, if you think about it, an awkward daily demonstration of an idea the whole system was built to deny. So the state permitted the plots and permitted a limited amount of selling at designated markets, because frankly the country needed the food. You could take your surplus produce to the collective farm market and sell it to willing buyers. This was legal, tolerated, even necessary. Fresh vegetables, eggs and the like flowed through these markets and put food on tables that the official system struggled to fill. But there were firm limits, and the limits were the whole point. You could sell what your own little plot produced. What you could not do was turn it into an enterprise. You could not start buying produce from others to resell, because that was speculation. You could not scale up into anything resembling a private farming business, hiring workers and chasing profit, because that struck at the very heart of the collective principle. The line between selling your own surplus and running a private business was the line between tolerated and criminal. So the potato grower lived in a narrow, carefully bounded zone of permission. Grow on your patch, sell your extra, keep it small and personal, and all was well. Get clever, get organised, get ambitious, start thinking like an entrepreneur, and you tumbled off the edge into forbidden territory. The state was happy to let you feed yourself and sell a little on the side. It was not willing to let you become, in miniature, the very thing it had abolished. There is something almost comic about a superpower keeping such a careful eye on the scale of a peasant's vegetable stall, making sure the carrot seller didn't accidentally evolve into a capitalist. But it flowed directly from the core belief. Profit from trade was suspect. Private enterprise was forbidden, and even the humble potato could, if sold too enthusiastically, become politically dangerous. So sell your modest surplus with a clear conscience, comrade, and resist the entrepreneurial gleam in your eye. And while we are on the subject of small private treasures the state kept a careful watch on, let us open that drawer where your grandmother's gold is quietly hidden. Deep in a drawer sits your grandmother's gold. A few old coins, a heavy ring, a little private insurance against a very uncertain century. The state, however, took an extremely keen interest in precious metals, restricting private dealing in gold and foreign valuables and folding such offences into those same fearsome currency laws. Quietly buying and selling gold on the side could be treated as a serious economic crime, so that comforting little hoard is not simply savings, it is a secret, And secrets in this particular country have an unsettling habit of turning themselves into charges. Gold occupies a special place in the human imagination. Across nearly all of history, in nearly every culture, it has been the thing you hold on to when you trust nothing else. A dense little nugget of value that survives wars, inflations, and collapsing regimes. When the money is unreliable and the future is uncertain, people reach for gold. It is the oldest financial instinct there is, and it was exactly this instinct that the state wanted firmly under its own control. Because gold, like foreign currency, represented value that lived outside the official system. A person with a hoard of gold had a private store of wealth that the state did not fully command, wealth that could be exchanged, hidden, or used to buy things through unofficial channels. To a system that wanted control over the entire economy, that independence was a problem. So dealing privately in precious metals and valuables was hemmed in by law and swept into the same category as the currency offences, with the same shadow of severe punishment hanging over the largest cases. This did not mean you were arrested for owning your grandmother's wedding ring. Family jewellery, personal heirlooms, the ordinary precious objects passed down through generations, these existed in every home. The danger lay in dealing, in the buying and selling, in trafficking in gold as a way to store and move wealth outside the system. That was where the ordinary human instinct to protect your savings collided with the law. So people with gold were quietly careful. That little cash in the drawer or sewn into a hem was rarely something to be discussed, flaunted, or casually traded. It sat there as a hedge, a secret comfort, a just-in-case, held close and mentioned to no one. In a world where the official currency inspired limited confidence and the future felt precarious, a bit of gold was reassurance you could hold in your palm. And it was reassurance you kept absolutely quiet about. The whole thing reveals the same underlying anxiety we keep bumping into. The state wanted to be the sole master of value, the only legitimate keeper of wealth, the single channel through which economic life was supposed to flow. Foreign currency threatened that. Speculation threatened that. Private business threatened that. And a drawer full of gold threatened it too, in its small dense way, a private vault the state did not hold the key to. There is a certain poignancy in imagining it. A family's entire margin of safety, everything standing between them and disaster, reduced to a few gleaming objects hidden away and never spoken of, not spent, not enjoyed, just held quietly, against a rainy day the state would rather they not prepare for on their own. So keep that little hoard close and keep it quiet, comrade, and do not go trading it in the shadows. And speaking of things that gleam and get you into trouble, let us pick up an instrument, because in the wrong decade, even a saxophone could be treated as a symptom of treason. Tonight you feel like a little jazz. Careful with that saxophone, comrade. In certain periods, jazz was condemned as decadent Western noise, a corrupting foreign import, and there was a genuine campaign against it, complete with the marvellous warning that today he plays jazz and tomorrow he sells his motherland. Saxophones were confiscated, bands were pressured, and swinging too freely was politically unwise. So play softly, if you must play at all, because in the wrong decade a few improvised notes could be read not as music but as the first faint symptom of treason. Jazz was a problem for the state in a very particular way. It came from the West, and specifically from America, the great ideological rival. It was associated with nightclubs, with freedom, with improvisation, with a loose and joyful individualism that sat uneasily beside the disciplined collective spirit the system prized. Jazz did not march in step. It wandered, it soloed, it did unexpected things, and a music that celebrated the individual player breaking free of the arrangement was, in a sense, quietly subversive by its very nature. So during the hardest campaigns against Western influence, jazz was denounced. It was cast as the sound of a rotting culture, noise designed to soften the mind and corrupt the young. That wonderfully menacing slogan, the one warning that the jazz player of today becomes the traitor of tomorrow, captures the whole paranoid leap perfectly. It draws a straight line from a saxophone solo to national betrayal, as if a catchy tune were the first step down a slope that ended in selling out your country. The saxophone itself became a kind of villain, the very emblem of this dangerous foreign sound. There were periods when the instrument was treated with real hostility, when saxophones were confiscated and players pushed toward more acceptable, more wholesome instruments and styles. Imagine an instrument being politically suspect, a curl of brass and keys deemed ideologically unsound. The horn that in one country fills a smoky club with warmth was in another a small metal suspect. Musicians adapted, as musicians always do. Some played the safer, approved music in public and saved the forbidden sounds for private gatherings. Some found ways to smuggle jazz into acceptable forms, dressing it up, softening its edges, hiding its spirit inside something that could pass inspection. The music went underground and into living rooms, played from those crackling bone records and heard drifting in over the jammed foreign radio, learned by ear and cherished all the more for being forbidden. And the attitude shifted with the times, as these things did. The fiercest hostility belonged to particular periods, and in calmer, more open eras, jazz was tolerated and even, eventually, embraced and celebrated. The state's relationship with the saxophone blew hot and cold, condemning it in one decade and applauding it in another, depending on the political weather. The music itself never changed, only the official verdict on it did. But for a while there, loving jazz meant loving something the state had branded a threat, and playing it too freely meant marking yourself as someone drawn to the decadent West. A few improvised bars, a little too much swing, and you were no longer just a music lover. You were, in the eyes of the suspicious, a person of questionable loyalty, a saxophone away from betrayal. So play your forbidden notes softly, comrade, behind a closed door, and let the melody wander where the state would rather it did not. And if a saxophone could be treason, you can imagine what happened to a painter who dared to paint the wrong sort of picture. You are feeling creative, so you paint. But you paint something abstract, something strange, something that stubbornly refuses to show a heroic worker gazing bravely at a tractor. Problem. The only officially approved artistic style was socialist realism. An abstract or nonconformist art was condemned and suppressed. In 1974, the authorities famously broke up an unofficial open-air exhibition using actual bulldozers and water cannons. So express yourself. By all means, just be sure your self-expression features excellent posture, honest collective labour, and absolutely no confusing shapes. Socialist realism was the one approved way to make art, and its rules were clear. Art existed to serve the state and inspire the people. It should be realistic, so ordinary citizens could understand it at a glance. It should be optimistic, showing a bright and heroic vision of Soviet life. And it should be uplifting in an ideologically correct direction, celebrating labour, progress, the collective and the leadership. Strong workers, noble soldiers, bountiful harvests, gleaming factories, all rendered in a clear and heroic style. That was art doing its proper job. Anything that strayed from this was suspect. Abstract art, which showed no clear heroic subject, was seen as pointless at best and decadent at worst. A self-indulgent Western game with no service to offer the people. Art that was dark, ambiguous, personal, experimental, or critical had no place in the official galleries. The individual artist following his own strange private vision, rather than serving the collective with clear uplifting images, was working against the grain of the entire system. So a whole world of unofficial art grew up in the shadows, made by painters who could not or would not fit the approved mould. They created for themselves, for small circles of friends, for a handful of collectors, showing their work quietly in apartments because the public galleries were closed to them. It was the visual cousin of samizdat, art that existed outside the official channels, passed among people who understood, kept away from the disapproving official eye. And then came the moment that captured the whole clash in one unforgettable scene. In 1974, a group of nonconformist artists organised an open-air exhibition on an empty lot, simply setting up their unapproved paintings out in the open. The response was extraordinary in its bluntness. The authorities moved in with bulldozers and water cannons and physically destroyed the show, knocking down the artwork, soaking the crowd, and turning an art exhibition into a demolition site. It became known, fittingly, as the Bulldozer Exhibition. There is something almost cartoonishly heavy-handed about it, a state responding to a few unauthorized paintings on a vacant lot with heavy machinery, as though a canvas of confusing shapes were a fortress to be stormed. But it perfectly expressed the underlying attitude. Unapproved art was not merely to be ignored, it was to be crushed, literally under the treads of a bulldozer, made an example of, cleared away like rubble. And yet, as with the jokes and the books and the music, the suppression could not quite finish the job. The very brutality of the Bulldozer Exhibition drew attention, embarrassed the authorities, and in its aftermath the unofficial artist actually won a small measure of grudging space. You can flatten the paintings, but you cannot flatten the impulse that made them. The wrong kind of art kept getting made, in quiet studios and cramped apartments, by people who simply had to create what was in them, approval or no approval. So paint your confusing shapes if you must, comrade, but keep them indoors and keep them quiet, well away from any passing bulldozer, because the state had firm opinions not only about your pictures, but about how you chose to move your own body, and it was about to take issue with something as gentle as lying on the floor to stretch. You lie down on the floor to unwind with a little yoga. Even this could raise an official eyebrow. Mystical, spiritual and Eastern practices were often viewed as ideologically unsound, unscientific, and vaguely foreign, and at various times yoga circles and similar pursuits were quietly discouraged or pushed underground. The state greatly preferred its citizens focused on shared collective goals rather than personal enlightenment on a rented mat. So breathe deeply, find your centre, and try not to look too serene about it. Because in a society built on productive struggle, inner peace itself can start to seem a little suspicious. The problem with yoga, from the official point of view, was almost philosophical. Here was a practice tangled up with foreign spiritual traditions, with ideas about the soul, with a turning inward toward personal transcendence. The system was built on materialism, on the belief that the physical, measurable world was all there was, and that human energy should be poured outward into the collective, into labour, into building the shared future. A discipline that told you to sit quietly and seek enlightenment within yourself pulled in exactly the wrong direction. So spiritual and mystical pursuits of many kinds occupied an awkward, shadowed corner. They were not always the subject of dramatic crackdowns, but they were regarded with a raised eyebrow, treated as unscientific nonsense at best, and quietly foreign influence at worst. Groups that gathered to practice these things often did so discreetly, sharing knowledge in private, passing along instructions the way other people passed along forbidden books, keeping their gentle pursuits out of the disapproving official gaze. There is a particular absurdity in a mighty state concerning itself with whether its citizens were sitting cross-legged and breathing mindfully. Picture the sheer contrast. On one side, an enormous apparatus devoted to industry, ideology and control. On the other, a person on a floor, eyes closed, simply trying to find a moment of calm. And the enormous apparatus in certain moods, regarding that quiet person with faint suspicion, as though inner stillness were a small leak in the great collective effort. Part of the wariness was about foreignness. These practices came from elsewhere, from cultures and traditions outside the approved world, and anything from outside carried that faint charge of the alien and the untrusted, the same charge that clung to jazz and jeans and foreign radio. Part of it was about individualism. A person seeking personal enlightenment was, in a small way, prioritizing their own inner journey over the shared march forward, and the shared march forward was supposed to come first. And part of it, honestly, was just the general instinct of the system to have an opinion about everything. In a society where the state took a position on your work, your home, your reading, your music, and your art, it is almost unsurprising that it would eventually have thoughts about your breathing exercises too. There was very little that fell entirely outside the reach of official approval or disapproval. Even relaxation could be politically shaded. So people who wanted the calm, the stretch, the quiet centering that these practices offered simply did them quietly, on their own terms, in their own spaces, without advertising it. Another small private thing held close, enjoyed in the corners of life where the official eye did not quite reach. Peace of mind as a modest personal underground. So breathe slow and easy, comrade, find your center and keep your serenity to yourself. Because the state did not stop at policing how you moved your body. It went so far as to police which scientific truths you are permitted to believe, right down to the humble genetics of a pea plant. Now, for a strange one. Suppose you are a biologist, and you happen to believe in genetics, the ordinary, correct, humble pea plant kind first worked out by Mendel. In much of the mid-20th century, that belief could quietly end your career. Under the agronomist Trofim Lysenko, mainstream genetics was denounced as bourgeois pseudoscience, banned from being taught, and scientists who dared to disagree were dismissed, arrested, or worse. An entire branch of real science was outlawed in favour of politically convenient nonsense. So keep your chromosomes to yourself, Professor, because around here the party has firm opinions about your peas. This is one of the darkest and most bizarre chapters in the history of science, and it happened because ideology was allowed to overrule evidence. Genetics, the real science of how traits pass from one generation to the next through genes, had a small inconvenient feature. It suggested that some things were fixed by inheritance, not endlessly reshaped by environment and effort. And that sat badly with a worldview built on the idea that anything, even human nature, could be transformed by the right conditions. Enter Trofim Lysenko, an ambitious agronomist who rejected mainstream genetics and promoted his own competing theories, ideas that fit the official ideology far more comfortably. He claimed, roughly, that organisms could be transformed by their environment and pass those acquired changes on, that with the right treatment you could reshape crops and boost harvest dramatically. It was appealing, it was optimistic, it promised agricultural miracles, and it flattered the belief that nature was infinitely malleable. There was just one problem. It was wrong. But being wrong did not matter, because Lysenko had political backing. His views were embraced at the highest levels and elevated into official truth. And once a scientific position becomes official truth, disagreeing with it stops being a scientific debate and becomes something closer to disloyalty. Mainstream genetics was denounced, branded a reactionary bourgeois pseudoscience, and effectively banned. It was removed from teaching. The real geneticists were the ones in trouble now, and the cost to those scientists was terrible. Researchers who defended genuine genetics were pushed out of their positions, silenced, arrested, and in the most tragic cases died in imprisonment. One of the great biologists of the era, a brilliant and internationally respected figure, fell afoul of this campaign and perished in prison. An entire generation of Soviet biology was warped and set back, its best minds punished for the crime of being right, when the state had committed itself to being wrong. The consequences reached beyond ruined careers. Because the pseudoscience was applied to actual agriculture, real farming policy was built on ideas that did not work, contributing to failures and hardship. This is the deadly danger of forcing science to bow to ideology. Reality does not care about the official line. The peas grow the way the genes say they grow, no matter how firmly the state insists otherwise, and when policy ignores that, real harm follows. Eventually, long after enormous damage had been done, the pseudoscience was discredited and real genetics was restored. But the episode stands as a permanent warning, a case study in what happens when a government decides it can legislate scientific truth, punishing the honest researcher and rewarding the politically convenient fraud. It is one thing to ban a book. It is another, and somehow more chilling, to ban a fact. So guard your quiet, correct understanding of inheritance, comrade, and do not argue with the official biology. Because the state did not only forbid true science, sometimes it briefly forbade the very science of the future, denouncing the study of thinking machines as a capitalist trick. You are wildly excited about computers, about the beautiful idea of thinking machines and the whole science of information. For a while, that enthusiasm was heresy. In the early Cold War years, Soviet ideologists denounced cybernetics as a reactionary bourgeois pseudoscience and a capitalist trick, before quietly reversing course once they realized just how badly they were going to need it. So your visionary excitement about the future of computing was, briefly, the wrong opinion to hold out loud. Nothing quite signals confidence in your worldview like banning the very science that is about to run the next century. Cybernetics, in its early days, was the grand science of control and communication, of how systems, whether machines, animals, or societies, process information and regulate themselves. It sat at the root of what would become computing, automation, and information theory, some of the most world-changing ideas of the modern age. And for a stretch, Soviet ideology looked at this dawning field and decided it was the enemy. The reasons were tangled up in politics and suspicion. The science had emerged largely in the West, which made it automatically suspect, another foreign import to be regarded warily. And there was an ideological objection too. The idea of describing living things and even human society as information processing systems, as mechanisms to be understood in terms of feedback and control, clashed with the official philosophy. It seemed to reduce the noble human being and the grand sweep of history to mere machinery, and that felt wrong to the ideological gatekeepers. So cybernetics was denounced, dismissed as a reactionary pseudoscience, a bourgeois trick, an idea unworthy of serious socialist attention. The problem, of course, was that cybernetics was not a trick, it was the future. It underpinned computing, automation, and the entire coming information age. And in the great contest between the two superpowers, falling behind in exactly these fields was a genuine strategic disaster. You cannot win a technological race while officially denouncing the technology. At some point, reality sends the bill. So the state did what states sometimes do when their ideology crashes into hard necessity. It quietly changed its mind. The denunciations faded, the field was rehabilitated, and before long cybernetics went from suspect heresy to embraced priority, pursued with real energy and investment. The very science that had been branded a capitalist trick became something the state urgently wanted to master. The verdict flipped, as verdicts did. But those lost early years mattered. Time spent denouncing a field is time not spent developing it, and the head start surrendered during the period of ideological hostility was not easily recovered. It is a smaller cousin of the genetics disaster, the same fundamental error in a different costume. Ideology declared a scientific truth off limits. Reality proved indifferent to the declaration, and the country paid a price in progress lost. There is a rich irony in it all. A system that prided itself on being scientific, on being the rational, forward-looking answer to a superstitious past, managed at various moments to ban actual science on ideological grounds, from the genetics of inheritance to the science of computation. The label of scientific was worn proudly, even as genuine science was sometimes shown the door for holding the wrong political implications. So keep your excitement about thinking machines to yourself for now, comrade, at least until the official winds shift, which, being winds, they will. Because the state had a particular horror of anything that could spread ideas quickly, and that brings us back to the humble, heavily guarded machine that could copy a page. Back once more to the dangerous world of machines that make copies, photocopiers, mimeographs, anything that could reproduce a page quickly and quietly, were controlled, restricted, and frequently kept under lock and key with careful logs of who used them and precisely why. In a country where information was power, the humble office copier was practically a weapon of state. So no, you cannot simply pop over and run off 100 pages of whatever you like. Every copy is counted, every operator is known by name, and that mundane press of a button is watched like a state secret. We touched on this with the typewriter, but the copier deserves its own moment, because it represents the state's information anxiety in its purest form. A typewriter makes copies slowly, painfully, a few carbon sheets at a time. A copying machine makes them fast, cleanly, in bulk. And speed, from the state's point of view, was the truly dangerous part. A single unwatched copier could turn one forbidden document into 1,000 in an afternoon. That was not an office convenience, that was a potential flood. So the copier was treated as something close to a controlled substance. In workplaces that had one, it was often kept in a locked room, operated only by authorized and trusted staff, and its use was logged. If you wanted something copied, you frequently could not just do it yourself. You had to go through the proper channels, get the proper approval, and have the proper person make the copies, with a record kept of what was reproduced and for whom. The machine that in another country sat ignored in a corner, jamming and running out of toner, was here an object of genuine institutional caution. Think about how strange that is against the modern experience. Today, copying and sharing information is effortless and infinite. A document can be duplicated and sent around the entire world in the time it takes to sneeze. We swim in an ocean of frictionless copies and barely notice. The idea that reproducing a page could be a monitored, restricted, approval-requiring act feels almost impossible to imagine. But that friction was entirely deliberate. The whole point was to make copying hard, because the state understood something fundamental about power and information. Whoever controls the ability to reproduce and spread words controls, to a large degree, what people can know and share. Ideas need to travel to have force. A brilliant, dangerous, subversive text that exists as a single copy is a limited threat. The same text, copied 1,000 times and scattered across the country, is a movement. So the state guarded the copiers precisely to keep the dangerous ideas trapped as single copies, unable to multiply and spread. It is why samizdat was so laborious, so heroic in its way. Denied the fast machines, dissidents fell back on the slow ones. typing and retyping by hand night after night, precisely because the quick and easy method was locked away. The guarded copier is the negative image of the underground typist. One machine, freely available, would have made the whole painful carbon copy world unnecessary, so that machine was not made freely available. There is a grim compliment buried in all this control. The state clearly believed, quite rightly, that information was one of the most powerful forces there was, more dangerous than smuggled goods or foreign money, worth guarding with locks and logs and approvals. It respected the power of the copied page enough to fear it. So leave the copier to the authorized hands, comrade, and make your copies the slow and secret way if you must make them at all. Because after all this careful control of words and ideas, you might simply want a stiff drink, and even brewing your own could put you on the wrong side of the law. It is bitterly cold, you are thirsty, and you begin to consider brewing a little something yourself. Distilling samagon, homemade moonshine for sale or in any real quantity was illegal, and the authorities periodically cracked down on private stills with considerable enthusiasm. Making your own strong spirit stepped squarely on the state monopoly and, more importantly, the state's revenue, which the state took rather personally. So that cosy image of a homemade batch bubbling gently away in the shed is not folksy tradition here. It is unlicensed competition with the government, and this government does not enjoy competition of any kind. The heart of the matter was money and control. The state held a monopoly on the production and sale of alcohol, and that monopoly was enormously profitable. The sale of vodka and other spirits poured a river of revenue into the state's coffers, one of its most reliable sources of income. Every bottle sold through official channels was money in the treasury, and every bottle of homemade samagon distilled quietly in someone's kitchen or shed was, by definition, a sale the state did not make and money it did not collect. So samagon was not merely a health or public order concern. It was economic sabotage in miniature, a private citizen quietly cutting the state out of one of its best businesses. Distilling your own spirits in any real quantity, and certainly selling it, was against the law, and the authorities went after the practice in waves, cracking down on stills and punishing the distillers when the mood and the policy demanded it. Of course, the practice was ancient and stubborn, and absolutely everywhere. Samagon was woven deep into folk life, a rural tradition older than the state itself. People had always made their own strong drink, and no amount of official disapproval was going to fully stop them. Especially in hard times, in shortages, in the endless cold, the temptation to brew your own was powerful and constant. So the still went underground, hidden away, its telltale smell and equipment carefully concealed from prying eyes. The situation reached its most dramatic point during the great anti-alcohol campaign in the mid-1980s, when the state, worried about the toll of heavy drinking, tried to sharply reduce official alcohol production and sales. The intention had its merits, but the effect on the samagon world was almost comic. With official liquor suddenly scarce and expensive, people simply made even more of their own. Home distilling boomed, and in a wonderfully absurd twist, sugar, the key ingredient for moonshine, began vanishing from the shelves as everyone bought it up to brew with, until sugar itself had to be rationed in places. The campaign against drinking accidentally launched a golden age of illegal distilling. It is a perfect little parable of the whole system. The state tries to control a deep human appetite by decree. The appetite simply reroutes itself into the shadows, and the unintended consequences ripple outward in ways no one planned. You squeeze the official supply, and the unofficial supply swells to fill the gap, dragging the sugar supply down with it. Control evaded, producing new distortions. So the backyard distillery bubbled on, quietly, illegally, defiantly, an underground answer to an official monopoly, as much a fixture of life as the vegetable plot and the hidden radio. Another small domain where ordinary people did what people have always done, and the state disapproved, and life went on regardless. So hide your still well, comrade, and share your samagon only with those you trust. And while we're on the subject of stocking up against hard times, let us look in your pantry, because even buying a bit too much could quietly make you a suspect. You go shopping and sensibly enough you buy a little extra, because the shelves here have a nasty habit of being empty. But buy too much and you become a hoarder, and hoarding scarce goods could itself be treated as antisocial behaviour, right down to the genuinely strange case of buying cheap subsidised bread to feed to your own livestock, which the state actively tried to stamp out. So filling your pantry against the next inevitable shortage, surely the most reasonable instinct imaginable, quietly turns you into a suspect. In a land of scarcity, even simple prudence starts to look like a plot. The whole thing grew out of the defining feature of daily life: shortage. The official economy was a chronic, unpredictable machine of scarcity. Goods came and went without warning. Something plentiful today might vanish for weeks tomorrow. This produced a completely rational survival behaviour in the population. When you saw something available, you bought as much as you could, whether you needed it right then or not, because you had no idea when you would see it again. The famous queues formed the instant a rumour spread that something desirable had appeared. So people stockpiled. They hoarded staples, hoarded anything durable and useful, hoarded whatever they could get their hands on, building little private reserves against the next dry spell. It was not greed, it was foresight, the sensible response of intelligent people to an unreliable system. If the shops cannot be trusted to have what you need when you need it, then you keep a stash and you grab opportunities when they come. But this rational individual behaviour clashed with the collective good, and the state knew it. When everyone rushes to hoard the moment something appears, the shelves empty even faster. Shortages deepen, and the panic feeds itself. So hoarding scarce goods could be frowned upon, and, in various ways, treated as antisocial, as a selfish act that worsened the situation for everyone else. The prudent stockpiler and the condemned hoarder were the same person, seen from two different angles. And then there is the wonderfully specific case of the bread and the livestock, which captures the absurdity of a planned economy in one perfect image. Bread was heavily subsidized, kept artificially cheap so that no one would go hungry. Animal feed, meanwhile, was its own separate and often less convenient thing. So, enterprising rural folk noticed that subsidized bread was actually cheaper than proper feed, and began buying up loaves of bread to feed to their pigs and chickens. The state, horrified at watching its subsidized bread go down the throats of livestock, actively tried to stop the practice. People were, in effect, breaking the rules by feeding bread to pigs. Sit with that for a moment. The price controls were so distorted that bread meant for people became the cheap option for fattening animals, and stopping citizens from feeding bread to their pigs became a genuine concern of the state. It is the kind of thing you could not invent, a direct and faintly hilarious consequence of trying to command an entire economy by decree, setting prices that made no sense and then policing the strange behaviours those senseless prices produced. So the pantry became one more small arena of tension. Buy sensibly and you are prudent. Buy a bit more and you are a hoarder worsening the shortage. Buy cheap bread for your pig and you are undermining the subsidy. The ordinary act of provisioning your household was threaded with invisible lines you could accidentally cross. So stock your shelves with care, comrade, and keep the bread away from the livestock. Because after a day of navigating all these quiet rules, you might finally be tempted to say what you actually think out loud, and that is where things turn serious again. You are frustrated. The prices, the endless queues, the shortages, the whole grinding daily business of getting by, and you say so loudly to entirely the wrong person. This is where things turn serious again, and so we tread carefully. Spreading anti-Soviet views, what the law termed agitation and propaganda, was a real criminal charge under which a great many people were imprisoned or confined. An ordinary grumble, that near sacred human right to complain about your own government, could be written down as subversion. So vent quietly, comrade, and choose your audience with enormous care, because in this country the walls have not only ears, but paperwork. Complaining is one of the most ordinary human activities there is. Everywhere, in every age, people grumble about their leaders, their prices, their conditions, their luck. It is a release valve, a small daily freedom, a way of coping with the frustrations of life by saying them out loud to someone who understands. In much of the world, it is so normal it is invisible, the background noise of any bus stop or kitchen table. Here, taken too far or heard by the wrong ears, it could be a crime. The law made spreading anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda a genuine offence. In practice, this could stretch to cover a wide range of speech, from organised dissent down to careless words. Telling the wrong person that the system was failing, that the leaders were incompetent, that life was better elsewhere, could be recorded, reported and used against you. Over the decades, large numbers of people were imprisoned or otherwise punished, under charges rooted in what they had said or written, their words treated as acts against the state. This gave rise to a whole culture of guarded speech, of learning what could be said where and to whom. In public, at work, among people you did not fully trust, you kept your true thoughts locked away behind a bland, careful surface. The real conversations, the honest complaints, the frank assessments of how things actually were, happened in private, among the trusted few, often in the same kitchen where the jokes were told with the tap running. There was a public voice and a private voice, and the gap between them was where an entire nation kept its real opinions. The presence of informers made this doubly fraught. You could never be entirely certain who might report you. A colleague, an acquaintance, even someone close, might carry your careless words to the authorities, whether out of belief, ambition, pressure, or fear. This bred a deep and corrosive caution, a habit of self-censorship so ingrained that people learn to guard their tongues almost without thinking. The most dangerous thing was often not the government official, but the ordinary person listening a little too attentively. The human cost of this is worth pausing on, because it is real and heavy. There is a particular loneliness in not being able to say what you truly think, in having to swallow your honest reactions to your own life, in weighing every frank word against a possible knock at the door. It corrodes trust between people, it isolates, it forces a person to live partly in hiding, even inside their own conversations. The simple relief of speaking your mind, that most basic human thing, was rationed and risky. And yet people did speak carefully, in the safe spaces they carved out, because the need to be honest somewhere, with someone, is powerful. The kitchen conversations, the trusted friendships, the whispered truths, these were where people stayed human, where they held on to their real selves beneath the guarded public mask. So choose your listeners with great care, comrade, and save your honest words for the people you trust most. Because if speaking your mind carried such weight, there was another law, still crueler, that reached into the most private corner of a person's life, and it deserves to be spoken of plainly. This one deserves plain seriousness rather than any jokes. Under Article 121 of the Criminal Code, sexual relations between men were made a crime, and those convicted faced years of imprisonment in harsh camps. Countless lives were quietly ruined by a law that punished people simply for who they loved, and it remained on the books for decades. There is nothing funny anywhere in it. So tonight we will simply acknowledge it honestly and set it down gently. In the Soviet Union, an entirely ordinary and human thing, love, was for many people turned into a crime, and the real cost of that fell on real people. The law was introduced in the earlier part of the Soviet era and endured for a very long time, casting its shadow across generations. It criminalized intimacy between men and carried the threat of a prison sentence, meaning years of a person's life could be taken away for nothing more than who they were and whom they loved. This was not an obscure statute quietly ignored. It was enforced, and it destroyed lives, careers, and families across the decades it stood. To understand the full weight of it, imagine living under it. Imagine that a fundamental part of who you are, your capacity for love and closeness, had to be hidden completely, always, from everyone. Imagine that a single discovery, a careless moment, a betrayal, an investigation could mean prison, disgrace, the loss of everything you had built. Imagine the constant grinding fear of it, the impossibility of ever living openly, the loneliness of a life spent in permanent concealment. That was the daily reality the law imposed on countless people. The isolation this created is difficult to fully grasp. There was no possibility of an open community, no safety in numbers, no public acknowledgement that people like you existed and had worth. There was only secrecy and the danger that came with any attempt to find connection. People carried this in silence, often entirely alone, unable even to speak of it to those closest to them. The law did not just punish through prison. It punished through fear, through hiding, through the slow suffocation of forcing a whole dimension of human life into permanent darkness. And the punishment, when it came, was severe. Conviction meant the camps, the same brutal system of imprisonment and hard labour that swallowed so many others, with all its cold and hunger and cruelty. People emerged from it, if they emerged at all, broken by an ordeal they had done nothing to deserve. Others lived their entire lives under the threat, never convicted but never free, shaped and scarred by a law that told them their love was a crime. It is important to name this plainly and without softening it into something more comfortable. This was not a quirk or an oddity. It was a genuine cruelty, a law that inflicted real suffering on real human beings for decades, for no reason other than who they were. The pain of it echoed through countless individual lives that history has largely left unrecorded, private tragedies playing out behind closed doors, unspoken and unmourned. The law was eventually repealed in the years after the Soviet Union ended, but that came far too late for the many who had already suffered under it. Their stories deserve to be remembered honestly, held with the seriousness and compassion they were denied in their own time. So tonight we simply sit with this quietly, comrade, and acknowledge the ordinary human beings who paid so dearly for something that should never have been a crime at all. And with that solemn note held gently, we turn to something lighter to close, a harmless hobby that somehow also drew the state's suspicion, the gentle dream of a universal language. You take up what seems a harmless hobby, Esperanto, the gentle invented language dreamed up to unite all of humankind in peace. Somehow, even this drew suspicion. Under Stalin, Esperantists were viewed as dangerously international, as people with foreign contacts and therefore possible spies, and many were persecuted amid the broader campaigns against so-called rootless cosmopolitans. Simply wanting to write friendly letters to strangers across borders could mark you as insufficiently loyal to your own. So set down that peaceful universal language, comrade. Around here, wanting to talk to the whole world was exactly the sort of thing that got you noticed. Esperanto is one of the most idealistic ideas ever devised. It was created deliberately as a simple, neutral, easy-to-learn language that anyone in the world could use to speak to anyone else, a bridge across the barriers of nation and tongue, born from a genuine dream of human unity and peace. Its speakers, the Esperantists, formed a warm international community of pen pals and enthusiasts, writing to one another across borders, united by nothing more sinister than the hope that people everywhere might understand each other a little better. You would think a state devoted to international workers' solidarity might have loved this. And indeed, in the early years, Esperanto had a certain appeal, fitting with the dream of a united world proletariat speaking across all frontiers. But the mood curdled. As the atmosphere grew more paranoid and inward-looking, the very things that made Esperantists admirable, their foreign contacts, their international correspondence, their connections to people abroad, became precisely what made them suspect. Because in a climate of deep suspicion, contact with foreigners was danger, as we have already seen. And here was an entire community whose whole purpose was contact with foreigners, people who maintained networks of correspondence across many countries, who wrote regularly to strangers beyond the border. To the paranoid eye, this looked less like idealism and more like a ready-made spy network, a web of foreign connections just waiting to be exploited. The dreamers of universal brotherhood were recast as potential agents of foreign influence. So during the harshest years, Esperantists were swept up in the broader persecutions, caught in the campaigns against those accused of being too international, too connected to the outside, insufficiently rooted in loyalty to their own nation. That chilling phrase, rootless cosmopolitan, was used to condemn people whose horizons and sympathies extended beyond the approved boundaries, and the Esperantists, with their borderless language and their foreign friends, fit the accusation with terrible ease. Many suffered for their gentle hobby. There is a deep and bitter irony in it. A language created to bring humanity together in peace became, for its speakers, a source of danger, precisely because it brought them together with humanity. The dream of connection collided with a system that regarded connection to the outside world as a threat. Wanting to reach beyond your own borders, to speak with the whole of humankind, was turned into evidence against you. It captures, in a small and poignant way, the deep isolation the system imposed. A country that kept its people from travelling, that treated foreign contact with suspicion, that jammed foreign voices from the air, was never going to feel comfortable with citizens who dreamed in a language built for crossing every border. The Esperantist's open hand to the world was read as a hand reaching somewhere it should not. So keep your beautiful universal language as a quiet, private pleasure, comrade, and be careful whom you write to across the distant borders. Because there is one last ordinary dream we have not yet touched, the simple wish to earn a little from something you own, and even that gentle idea ran headlong into the wall. Finally, imagine you own a spare room, or a modest second place, and you would rather like to rent it out for a small and reasonable sum. In most of the world, this is simply called being a landlord. In the Soviet Union, it edged into the crime of unearned income, money made without honest labour, which the state regarded with deep and lasting hostility. Living off rent or property instead of work was ideologically forbidden. So that ordinary little dream of a bit of passive income, the quiet cornerstone of 1,000 modern retirement plans, was here not a strategy but an offence. And with that, comrade, your gloriously, exhaustingly illegal day is very nearly done. The idea at the root of it was the same one we have seen again and again tonight, the belief that all legitimate value came from honest labour. To work was virtuous. To produce something real with your own effort was the foundation of a proper socialist life. But to sit back and collect money simply because you happen to own something, to earn from property rather than from work, was viewed as a kind of parasitism, wealth without effort, income without contribution. The whole concept of the passive earner, the landlord, the rentier, was ideologically poisonous. So living off unearned income was condemned and in various ways treated as an offence against the proper order of things. The person who made their living by owning rather than working occupied roughly the same suspect moral category as the speculator and the parasite. Money that flowed to you while you did nothing was money that came, in the official view, from exploiting the labour of others, and exploitation was the great sin the whole system was built to abolish. This struck directly at ideas that much of the modern world treats as simple good sense: owning a second property and renting it out, building an income stream that does not depend on your daily labour, accumulating assets that work for you so that one day you might not have to work so hard yourself. These are ordinary financial aspirations, the stuff of countless retirement plans and quiet ambitions. Here they were not aspirations but transgressions. The dream of passive income was, in a real sense, against the rules. There is a certain grim consistency to it, tying the whole day together. Nearly everything we have talked about tonight comes back to a handful of core convictions: that the state should control the economy entirely, that value comes only from labour, that private wealth and private enterprise are suspect, that foreign things and foreign contacts are dangerous, that information must be tightly held. Owning property to profit from it violated the first three of those at once, and so it joined the long list of ordinary things quietly made forbidden. And so your day of gentle, relentless illegality reaches its end. You have hidden $1, worn forbidden jeans, played music off a skeleton, told a dangerous joke, worked because you had to, and arrived on time because you had to, resisted the urge to trade for profit, read a book typed by hand, guarded your typewriter, chased voices through the static, held your faith and your gold and your honest opinions close, and been told, at nearly every turn, that the most ordinary human impulses were, in some small bureaucratic way, against the law. It is exhausting even to imagine this life lived inside so many invisible lines. And yet, as we have seen over and over, people lived it, adapted to it, found the cracks in it, and stubbornly stayed human within it, which is in the end the quietly astonishing part of the whole story. So let your gloriously illegal day finally come to a close, comrade. The lamp is low, the curtains are drawn, and there is nothing left to do but rest. And as you drift off, we will take a moment to reflect on it all gently before you sleep. So there it is, comrade. A whole ordinary day, and almost every gentle part of it brushing quietly against the law. You hid $1 like buried treasure. You pulled on forbidden jeans and played music pressed into the bones of the anonymous dead. You swallowed your best jokes, guarded your quiet faith, and chased true voices through a howling storm of static. You could not simply leave, or freely choose where to live, or say out loud what you truly thought. Even a stretch on the floor, homemade drink, a full pantry, a spare room, a dream in a universal language, all of it shadowed by some small and watchful rule. It sounds unbearable, and for many people in the hardest ways it was. And yet here is the quiet miracle that runs beneath the whole strange story. People lived. They laughed in their kitchens with the tap running. They fell in love, wrote poetry by hand through the night, danced to smuggled songs, and held their real selves close and safe beneath the careful public mask. They found the crack in every wall the state ever built, patiently, stubbornly, endlessly, because that is simply what people do. So tonight, as you lie in your soft bed, free to read what you like, say what you think, go where you please, and dream in any language you choose, maybe spare a quiet thought for all those ordinary people who did without those freedoms and stayed human anyway. Their stubbornness, their humour, their gentle everyday defiance. It is a kind of quiet inspiration. There's nothing left to do now but rest. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day drift away. Breathe slow, breathe easy, and sleep well. You are free and you are safe, and that is no small thing at all.